Good afternoon. Greetings to everyone from Paris, and welcome to the second day of this workshop on the social and economic outcomes of environmental policies. My name is Elisa Lanzi, and I lead the work on modeling and outlooks at the OECD Environment Directorate. I will be chairing the workshop third session, which will focus on the unemployment implications of environmental policies. Yesterday was the first day, and the discussion provided an overview of empirical evidence on economic and social outcomes of environmental policies and on the impact of environmental policies on innovation and firm performance. This session will instead focus on the employment implications of environmental policies, and the next and last session will focus on the social and distributional impacts. Before we start, I just wanted to highlight how this topic is so very important in the context of the acceptability of environmental policies and the way forward for these policies to be more acceptable and more widely implemented. But despite its significant policy relevance, there is still limited empirical evidence on the employment implications of environmental policies. And from a modeler's point of view, that's a problem because it doesn't help us to look forward to then the possible future impacts. So in this session, 4 experts will present existing work and discuss challenges in terms of methodology and data. This will be then complemented by a discussion where you're invited to ask questions using the Zoom Q&A function. Overall, we're aiming to address a couple of main questions. So what is the empirical evidence of the impact of environmental policies on employment? How do these impacts differ across sectors and policy measures? And how can environmental policies minimize the negative employment effects or even lead to job creations? With that, I'd like to introduce our first speaker, Natalia Fabra. Natalia is professor of economics at the University Carlos III of Madrid. She works in the field of industrial organization with emphasis on energy and environmental economics, regulation, and competition policies. And she'll be giving us a presentation on renewable energy and how they can create local jobs. Natalia, please.
Thank you so much, Elisa, and thank you also for organizing this great workshop. So I'm gonna share the slides with you. Do you see them fine? Yeah. So I'm gonna be presented our paper, which is co-authored with some researchers at the Bank of Spain. Do renewables create local jobs? The starting point is well known by all of us here. Renewable energy is bound to increase significantly, certainly so in Europe and in the US. And the objective, certainly, it's an environmental one, but not only. We are relying on the energy transition also as a way to foster our economies in this post-COVID world, because we expect that investments in renewables will also bring several socioeconomic benefits. This is very well summarized in Biden's claim jobs, but not only, we know that the Green Deal also had the job creation as one of its mottos. In this quote that I took out from a Spanish newspaper, some of these benefits are being summarized. Renewables in Spain are expected not only to provide economic activity to rural areas, but also to translate this into jobs. So for instance, in this quote, you can see that they expect the impact of renewable complexes to revitalize these areas during the construction periods. Hundreds of workers will eat, consume, and sleep in the municipalities, and this will also leave training and jobs for the neighborhoods, alleviating the structural depopulation. So here in this quote, we can see the direct translation, as it is expected, of renewable energies also on the local communities where these investments take place. Yet, despite these socioeconomic benefits being well known, we are facing, I would say, one of the most important bottlenecks for the rollout of renewables, which is the opposition from local communities who oppose, in many cases, the deployment of renewables in their local areas, claiming that this will have a negative impact on biodiversity, landscape, land prices, real estate among others. So some economists have attempted to measure the local cost on all these dimensions, but in this paper, what we wonder is whether it is not only about local cost being faced by the local communities, but rather the other side of the equation is the local benefits. It might be the case that these rural communities are not benefiting from a large share of the social economic benefits that are delivered by these investments, at least not to an extent so as to offset this cost. So this is why in this paper, we are going to be focusing on the potential of renewable energies to create local jobs as a proxy of these socioeconomic benefits that can be reaped by the local communities. And our guiding question, our research question is how many jobs that are created by these investments stay within the municipality where the investment occurs. And for this purpose, we're going to focus on the Spanish case. As you know, Spain is a country where there's been a massive wave of renewable investments started in the 2006, 2007. So what we do is we estimate the local labor market effects of these renewable investments, exploiting the variation in the timing and in the size of both solar and wind investments across almost 3,000 municipalities. We're going to explore the differential effects on local employment and local unemployment of solar PV and wind investments. We're going to try to measure both the local effects as well as the spatial or spillover effects. And we're also going to try to explore whether there's differences in terms of the employment potential of the first wave of investments that took place up to 2014 or so, and the most recent wave that started in 2019. So this is visually a map of all the investments in our data set that we are going to be exploiting. On the left-hand side, you have solar investments in Spain. On the right-hand side, you have wind investments in Spain. As you can see, especially for the case of wind, they are widely rolled out across the country. And we have information on each one of these investment plans. We know exactly where they are located, the type of technology they use, their size, and also what is very important in the analysis, the date when these plants started up producing electricity, not when the construction started, but rather when they were ready to start producing electricity. Just very quickly, this is just a picture summarizing all the tasks that are involved in the construction of solar plants. And you see, at least out of this picture, they tend to be quite labor intensive, particularly so during the construction phase. But right before the plant is ready, there are some electronics that have to be dealt with. So there's different phases in this construction phase. The same applies to wind, but here we can see that it certainly requires more specialized labor force. Machinery is extremely specific to these investments, and this might explain some of the results that I'm going to show you later on. I'm going to be focusing both on employment and unemployment, and I just wanted to clarify to note that these data are providing different information regarding the impacts. Employment data is capturing the number of jobs at the firms, at the employers that are registered within the municipality, whereas unemployment data are reporting evidence on the number of residents who are unemployed. Okay, so keep this in mind because this is very important to understand the differences between the results on employment and unemployment. And there's other dimensions by which these two data sets are different. For instance, employment data is not affected by participation rates, whereas unemployment data it is. So for instance, if we see that there's people leaving the municipality for reasons other than the ones that we want to measure, probably this might have an impact on unemployment that should not be interpreted as a reduction of unemployment caused by the investments, and so on and so forth. So the fact that we put these two data sets together, we believe that they complement each other, and therefore they provide a richer picture of what is really going on in the local labor markets. So what is our empirical approach? So here you have our main estimating equation. We are going to estimate many of these equations that are period specific, and the reference period is going to be tau. Tau here represents the startup date of a given plan. So essentially what we're going to do is we're going to try to measure the impact of the investment, here is captured by K, which denotes the size of the plant, on employment and unemployment, some periods before and some periods after the startup date. So what happens during the periods before, and here a period is denoted a month. So this is very granular data from time series point of view. So each of these periods represents a month before the startup date. So some of these dates will correspond to the construction period. So typically, solar plant doesn't last more than, the construction of a solar plant doesn't last more than 24 months. So if we go back all the way to 3 years before the construction plant, we expect not to see any impacts there. So this is going to be a check for the parallel trends assumption. If we see no impacts 3 years before, this means that we are capturing and identifying a causal relationship between investments and the outcome variable. So you have to interpret this beta coefficient, which is our parameter of interest, as the job multiplier H periods before or H periods after the plant has been invested. So by estimating all these different equations at different moments of time, before and after the startup date, we managed to estimate a sort of impulse function by which we understand how investment at a given moment of time affects construction and how it affects maintenance. We're only going to focus in on municipalities with more than 1,000 inhabitants for censoring issues, and we are only considering all the plants in Spain where at least there was one plant opening in the robustness. We also consider the whole set of municipalities, including even those where no investment took place, and results remain robust. So let me show you the results, and let me try to clarify, to guide you through these figures, which are probably the most important ones of the paper. So let's focus on the left-hand side, which represents the effect of solar investment. So this red line represents the startup date when the plant has been, the construction has been finished, and the plant is ready to start producing electricity. And what you can see here, the blue line represents the job multipliers, the employment effects. So what do we see? We see that 20 months before the startup date, there's no effects. They are showing that before we are not capturing effects other than the effect of the investment itself. So 20 months before, we start seeing positive multipliers, meaning during the construction phase, these plants are creating employment. And once the plant is ready to operate, there's some employment created due to all the maintenance activities. And these numbers seem to be significant, as I'm going to show you later on. Instead, the case of wind is absolutely different. There's no effects whatsoever of wind investments on local investment, of local investments on the residents. So wind investments seem not to trigger any sort of employment creation by firms located in the municipality. And if we think about these results and we go back to the type of tasks that are involved, in a sense, this is not surprising because the firms and the workers that are involved in the construction and maintenance of wind plants, these are highly specialized workers that most likely do not live in the municipalities where the investment takes place, but rather move from cities outside. Whereas in the case of solar, these tasks are more simple, and in many cases, and at least this is what the data is telling us, they truly involve local firms and local residents. So this is just a table to show you the number of the multipliers. So if we look at the municipality level, we see that in the construction phase, every megawatt, new megawatts of solar capacity creates 2.6 new jobs by the local firms. And in the post-opening, that is in the maintenance periods, they create a bit less, 1.7. In the case of wind, nothing is going on. If we look at the county level, so this is a bigger geographical dimension, we see the results are a bit bigger in the case of solar as expected. Still in the case of wind, no action takes place. We can also express the same multipliers per €1 million invested to have a sense of how much it costs to create local jobs in euro terms. We can also look at the effects of unemployment. Again, let me remind you that this is unemployment by local residents. And we see that in the case of solar, we see a reduction of unemployment during the construction phase. You see the timing is very similar as the timing of unemployment. In the case of wind, again, we see no impact on unemployment during the construction phase and a slight reduction in unemployment during the maintenance phase. Again, keep in mind that we are talking about unemployment of local residents, whereas employment refers to employment by local firms. By comparing these two results, what does this suggest? This suggests that in the case of wind, maybe what happens is that the workers are being employed from abroad, the firms are employed from abroad. In the case of solar, the fact that we see that it's as local firms creating employment and unemployment firms and unemployment going down suggests that it's both local firms as well as some workers being hired locally, but also the fact that this affects the magnitude is smaller suggests that also many workers are employed by local firms, but workers coming from other cities. In the paper, there's a bunch of additional results looking at the effects on by sector, gender, age group, comparing the effects in rural and urban locations, looking at the differential effects of mega plants as compared to small plants, and also looking at the differences across the two waves and the spatial effects. Because I don't have the time, let me just highlight what the main findings are. As I showed you before, the employment and unemployment effects of solar are significant, whereas in the case of wind, they're either non-existent or very mild. Effects on employment seem to be larger, thus suggesting that many workers seem to be hired from elsewhere by local firms. We find that effects are stronger on urban municipalities rather than rural. Maybe this has to do with some of the issues that we're going to be discussing regarding the mismatch between the abilities of the workers and the demands of these investors who probably need specialized workers that they cannot find in the rural municipalities. We find that the new wave of investment was less important in terms of local job creation. And we find that there's some geographical spillovers, meaning that municipalities, at least the urban ones, benefit from investments in surrounding municipalities, probably because they provide the workers that these rural municipalities need to carry out the investment. Just to conclude, in the paper, we also have a forward-looking assessment on the number of local jobs that will likely be created during the current decade in Spain. And what we find is that there's a mismatch between what our model predicts and what the government included in its estimates. Those estimates refer to the national job creation, so they are not exactly comparable to our estimates that only refer to the local labor market effects. So what this suggests is that either the national estimates are a bit overestimated, or that the local effects are really a small fraction of the national effects, thus suggesting that if we really want to have local residents on board in the energy transition, we will have to share better the benefits of these investments with them, because at least in terms of local labor market effects, they don't seem to be benefiting as much as they should in order to, again, be on board and push all together for this process. Thank you so much.
Thank you very much, Natalia, for the really interesting presentation. We'll keep the question for the Q&A session at the end. So I'd like to now welcome the second speaker, Balázs Stadler. Balázs is an economist at the OECD Environment Directorate. Previously, he worked at the Economics Department, where he studied structural topics on labor markets and green growth. And today he'll be presenting us on the effects of energy prices and environmental policy stringency on manufacturing employment in OECD countries.
Yes, thank you, Aliza. Welcome everybody. So my name is Balázs Stadler, and I would talk about the effect of energy prices and environmental policy stringency on manufacturing employment. And this is a joint work with Anton de Schelepret and Daniel Nachtigal. So as we have seen it mentioned yesterday and today, there's a need for more stringent environmental policies to deliver on climate and other environmental goals. Despite this need, the progress in these areas has not been swift, and the reason for the strong opposition that it will lead to slowing economy and unemployment. And this view is perhaps most famously exemplified by former President Donald Trump, who pulled out of the Paris Accord because it would undermine the US economy and hamstring the American workers. On the other hand, we have the narrative of the huge job creation, the idea that environmental policies actually decrease unemployment, they will create more jobs and so on, which I copied here from a Forbes article. So there seem to be kind of a parallel narratives here, which, one of them could be the short run, other could be the long run, or just different sectors. But this is the relevant topic. And as it has been mentioned by Elisa, despite this relevancy, there are relatively few papers look at this issue empirically. I have split the previous literature into two parts. So the first part on the top looks at energy prices and carbon pricing. And that literature, that strand of literature found small negative effect of energy prices on employment and larger effect in energy and pollution intensive sectors. One of the big policy experiments, the EU ETS, these papers have found no effect on employment at all. In terms of other regulation, well, I say other regulation, but these are also other proxies of environmental policy stringency. So these also include studies of pollution abatement costs. They found very weak effect or no effect. And the other great policy experiment, the Clean Air Act amendment in the United States, has been studied, and they found negative effect, but also some evidence for reallocation happening across plans. So what this paper does, which contributes to this literature, looks at the effect of environmental policies on employment, more specifically manufacturing employment. Why the manufacturing? Well, it is energy intensive, it's pollution intensive, so it's exposed to environmental policies. Second, it is also easier to relocate production compared to other sectors. That's employment is likely to be sensitive to changes in environmental policy. We offer three main contributions to this literature. The first is that we look at the effect of energy prices and environmental policy stringency in a single estimation, and we differentiate between the two. Second, we not only look at the aggregate sectoral effects, but also the effects on the subsector, and also within the subsectors, the effect on firms. Now, a problem with firm level data is that only surviving firms are observed. And to address this shortcoming, our third contribution is to look at firm entry, and so the effect of energy prices and environmental policy stringency on firm entry and firm exit. So the idea is that we look at the aggregate picture and see how this outcome emerges from the finer scales. The methodology is a relatively straightforward panel model. We regress the log employment on the variables of interest, which is energy price and the environmental policy stringency indicator, plus some control variables, which is wage, capital, and labor productivity, and a number of different sets of fixed effects. I should also mention that for the firm level estimation, we also interact the EPS indicator with the sectoral energy intensity to kind of proxy the exposure to environmental policy. And that, as you can see, every right-hand side variable is lagged to dampen the problems of reverse causality and is logged to kind of help interpretation and exposition. In terms of data, we have a sample from 2000 to 2014, which includes almost all OECD countries. Our variables of interest, so energy price, comes from the SETO et al. Database, which is based on IEA's World Energy Balance. And we use the fixed weight energy price index. So the idea is that firms can shift their energy use to different cheaper fuels if there's an energy price increase, and that makes the energy price they face endogenous. And to reuse this endogeneity, we use the fixed shares. And environmental policy stringency comes from OECD work, which is a country year index. It summarizes the stringency of market and non-market based environmental policies into an index going from 1 to 6, 6 being the most stringent. Sectoral outcomes come from the World Input-Output Database. Firm level outcome come from Orbis, which is a firm level database containing more than 500,000 firms in multiple countries. And firm entry and exit data is from the OECD Business Demographic Database. So onto the results. So this is the sectoral estimation. as you can see, the results show that both energy prices and a stricter environmental policy stringency has a negative and significant effect on employment, but it seems to be relatively small in magnitude. So the coefficient on the energy price, which is minus 0.07, implies that a 10% increase in the energy price would reduce employment by 0.7%. And just to put that in perspective, in our sample, energy prices increased around 2% per year on average. So a 10% increase is a 5-year increase typically. So during 5 years, 0.7% of manufacturing employment is shed because of higher energy prices in the average OECD country. And similarly, a 10% increase in EPS, or environmental policy stringency, reduces sector level employment by 0.6%. Now, compared to energy prices, a 10% increase in this indicator is more typical. For example, the EU ETS, the introduction of the EU ETS was associated by a 20% increase in the European countries. But still, these effects appear to be small. And just to provide a bit further context, I put a quick scribble on the sides, an example from the United States, where we can compare these effects with other factors from the academic literature. So the model implies that between 2000 and 2014, around 15,000 workers per year lost their jobs because of rising energy prices. In comparison, if you look at robotization, it's almost 2 times more. And if we look at the effect on trade openness to China, it's 5 times more than the effect of energy prices. And I should also mention, I don't have time to show the heterogeneity check, but the effects are stronger in energy intensive sector, but still relatively small. And we don't find evidence of reallocation within the manufacturing sector. Moving to the firm level, a bit surprising results. Higher energy prices have a statistically significant small positive effect on employment level of surviving firms. Remember that we can only observe surviving firms. So a 10% increase in energy prices would increase the employment of the average surviving firm by 0.7%. Now, this seemingly contradicts the sector level results. It will be reconciled in the next slide in the firm entry exit results. But the environmental policy stringency still has a negative and small effect, which mirrors the sector level estimation. Now, before going into the details of the firm entry exit, I should mention here that the sample is shorter due to data limitations, and to maximize the number of observations, the effect of EPS and energy prices are estimated in separate regressions. So you can see that number of observation is different for the two, but this doesn't seem to be the problem based on a few robustness checks we have conducted. So the results clearly show that higher energy prices accelerate firm exit. So 10% increase in energy price leads to a 7.5% increase in number of firms exiting the market. The majority of these firms are micro firms, which employ less than 10 employees, but there's no evidence that higher energy prices would reduce or trigger firm entry. There's also no evidence for an effect of higher environmental stringency on firm exit or entry. I believe this is because of an issue, a general design issue of most environmental policy. I'm happy to discuss this later in the discussion part. And just to conclude and interpret the results, if we look at the effect of energy prices, what we see, there's a effect, small but negative effect on manufacturing sector, especially on the energy intensive sectors. Some less energy intensive sectors or subsectors experience no effect. But there's a positive effect on firm exit, which means that the surviving firms can kind of expand, they can increase output, which we have tested. So they increase output after energy price increase, and they can hire more labor because of that. And then if we look at the effect of environmental policy stringency, again, manufacturing employment goes down, similar picture, especially with energy intensive firms, and some less energy intensive firms experience no effect. There's no effect on firm entry and exit, and this seems to be just a general downward push on all firms. So just to conclude, we have found small effect in manufacturing, especially in pollution intensive sectors. Now, because our analysis is fundamentally short run and only looks at manufacturing sector, it should be considered the upper boundary of the true estimate. In the longer run, workers might find jobs in different sectors, such as the service sector. But of course, small effects are not no effects. So there are definitely short run costs of stricter environmental policies, even if they are temporary. And as it has been mentioned, these costs tend to be very localized and geographically concentrated. Thus might have political costs as well. And because of this, it is important to consider complementary labor market policies or other structural policies to help the affected workers find jobs quickly. With that, I'd like to conclude. Thank you for your kind attention and looking forward for the discussion.
Thanks a lot, Balázs, for a very interesting presentation on the sectoral aspects. I'd like to welcome our third speaker now, Francesco Vonna. Francesca is the head of the skills analysis team at the OECD Center for Skills. She also holds the British Academy Global Professorship at the University College London. She'll be presenting today on skills demand and benefits from reduced environmental damages. The floor is yours.
Thank you so much, Elisa. Thank you, everyone, for having me here. As Elisa said, I lead work on skills in the OECD Center for Skills. And in that context, I'm in charge of the OECD flagship publication, the Skills Outlook 2023. And I think my presentation follows nicely the previous two, because one of the factors that can shape the extent to which there are opportunities in the labor market coming from environmental policies. It's really about workers having the skill sets that will be needed in the future. I will present a range of some results and actually a little bit more of plans we have and the analytical approach we're going to use in the context of the skills outlook to examine, in a sense, to ensure that worst case scenarios in terms of potential unemployment rising from the implementation of environmental policies do not materialize, because workers have the skills needed to enter new jobs that will emerge as a result. Now, the work we do is really about trying to map the extent to which environmental conditions shape skill development, and then the extent to which the skills individuals have, on one hand, enable them to enter new and emerging occupations, but also to what extent, because of the labor market effects, in a sense, enable the implementation of environmental policies, because they bring about support for such policies rather than resistance. In our work, we try to answer 4 broad sets of policy-relevant questions. The very first one is whether environmental context, and we have done a lot of work on air pollution and extreme temperatures, influence the development of skills on one hand, and effective skills use in the context of labor markets, for example. The second question we ask ourselves is, what are the skills that will be in demand as a result of the green transition? And the goal there is really about going to the third set of questions, trying to ensure that education and training systems equip young people so that they will have the skills needed in the future, but also in the present and medium term, promote upskilling and reskilling efforts among current workers so that they can transition in new jobs that will emerge. And finally, we have a little bit of work on whether environmental shocks on one hand, but also economic conditions, and more specifically unemployment, shape support for environmental policies or the prioritization of the economy over the environment. Now, going into a little bit of some of the results we have, this maps the extent to which temperatures and air pollution influence skills development over the life course. There are some effects that are direct, lowering the ability for individuals to learn and their capacity to learn in the long term. but also indirect effects. You can imagine environmental conditions shaping whether an individual is healthy or not, for example, having asthma, and then missing learning opportunities in school, and therefore lowering skills development. Some of these effects are transitory, meaning that they get removed once, for example, temperatures decrease, or they can be cumulative and remain over the life course. And finally, there is an important dimension in terms of inequalities, because some of the effects of environmental conditions affect, in particular, individuals because of, for example, lack of economic resources or lack of information, are not implementing adaptation and mitigation policies. So in that context, it affects the sorting of individuals, for example, in the context of high stakes examinations and entrance into specific fields. Now, the OECD, I don't know to what extent in this context they really work on skills, but the OECD is responsible for one of the most well-known exercises in terms of skills mapping among children, the Program for International Student Assessment, and evidence shows that when there are extremely hot days, there is a lower ability of individuals, and the effect of having additional school days when the temperatures are high is particularly large in contexts in which the adaptation of adoption technologies is lower. This can be air conditioning, but also others. Now, in terms of the work we are doing in collaboration, in fact, with Elisa and others from across the OECD, is to try to estimate the effect of policy packages on the demand for skills. And in particular, we're looking at the effect on skills that will result from the implementation of the Fit for 55 policy targets. Now, in that context, what a relatively major constraint is that most of the employment effects and changes in employment will come from, let's say, a redistribution in employment numbers across sectors, but and this will have an impact on the demand for skills because the skills needed in different sectors are not the same. But there's also evidence that there is a within sector across occupation potential effects. So in different sectors, individuals will be needed more in certain occupations rather than others. And finally, in a sense, as we move along in the adoption of environmental targets, the skills content of specific occupations will change, as technologies will mean that it will be the same job will need to be performed differently using different skills in order to comply with environmental regulations or promote a greener sort of use. And finally, we have some anecdotal evidence and case studies that there will be a need to not necessarily to have different skill sets, but actually to use these skills differently in order to save energy. For example, when you, for example, drive a train, the way in which you drive, so the skill remains the same, but the way in which you drive actually determines the energy consumption that you cause. Now, previous exercises in terms of estimating the skills impact of changes in employment due to the implementation of green policies really had a focus on the formal educational qualifications. Now, it was called, there will be an effect on low-skilled individuals, high-skilled individuals, but really what people were talking about was what kind of educational qualifications were needed. Now, what we are doing is actually use data on online vacancies to really identify the specific skills content of different occupations and try to really understand what is it that people will need to be able to do in order to perform the tasks needed as a result of Fit for 55 policy targets. Now, the importance of that is that the idea is then to identify upskilling and reskilling efforts and opportunities so that individuals will be able to acquire those sets of skills over the skills that they had in their previous occupations. And something that we're doing is actually look at labor force surveys to identify the age pattern, work status, and employer characteristics that determine the likelihood that individuals will be able or will be willing to participate in adult education and training. And finally, just some evidence on the role of past spells of unemployment. This is data from multiple years of World Value Survey matched with data on unemployment spells. And what we do see is that when unemployment went up, individuals were less likely to say that they were going to prioritize the environment over the economy. So unless you invest in skills, and in a sense ensure that people transit into new employment opportunities, there may be a backlash in terms of support for environmental policies. Now, just to conclude, what being at the OECD, it's really about thinking about the implication of policies. What we identify are a match of short, medium, and long-term policies that starts with the implementation of mitigation strategies to limit the effects of environmental changes on the development and use of skills. This can range from equipping health visitors to understand what are the conditions in individuals' homes in the very early days and early years, reorganizing when and where learning takes place. For example, mathematics is one dimension in which extreme temperatures and adverse events are especially harmful. So perhaps mathematics classes, failing everything else, can be shifted in the morning or in different classes that do not become so hot. Investing in adaptive technologies, hopefully not ones that will create problems down the line, such as air conditioning. And working on infrastructural investments and retrofitting equipment. And finally, in terms of reducing the impact on inequalities, reorganizing high-stakes exams for those who have children performing end of upper secondary schools exams in this moment. The heat wave that has spanned across Europe may create some of those problems. Now, in terms of participation in lifelong learning opportunities, which is one of the ways in which we can promote skills among adults, what we do know is that there is a sizable proportion of individuals who are currently not participating, but more worryingly, that are disengaged, that are not willing to participate. At the moment, around 6 in 10 adults are not participating, and 5 out of the 6 that are not participating report not being willing to participate. So improvements need to be made in terms of the quality of the training, but also the information and the financial packages that promote participation. And finally, more long-term, what we've looked at is the readiness of future generations, looking at data on 15-year-olds in terms of the cognitive skills, in terms of scientific literacy that will be needed in order to develop green technologies, but also some of the attitudinal dimensions and socio-emotional dimensions that really accompany the willingness to contribute to the green transition. And finally, thinking about skills and the fact that we are in the policymaking business, I would say that one of the big skills that is needed is the ability to solve problems, and in that context, perhaps we can learn from plants. Stefano Mancuso said that when faced with a problem, animals can flee, and sometimes they do, and so they don't engage with the problem. But plants actually evolved to stay put and to face challenges, and they are the ultimate problem solvers. Thank you very much.
Many thanks, Francesca. It's been really nice to see some of the ideas for solutions as well. I'd like now to introduce the last speaker of the session, Luke Haywood. Luke is an economist and policy analyst at the Climate Research Institute in Berlin, covering labor markets, tax policy, and transport economics. He'll be presenting on the welfare cost of job loss and decarbonization with evidence from Germany's coal phase-outs.
Great, thank you very much. Thanks for inviting me. It's a pleasure to be back at the OECD, even if virtually. And thanks for my fellow panelists. I think there's a lot of overlap, and not only because it's very hot in Berlin and there's no adaptive technology here. So yes, I will be talking about German coal phase out, and I'm considering workers squarely. So the welfare costs of job loss for coal miners in particular. So we've heard in the first two presentations, we've heard of employment effects, and jobs were considered as basically a good thing and the loss as a bad thing. But we rarely consider, well, how much is actually a job worth? What is the value of a job? Where does this value come from? And why is losing your job a problem? And obviously, these values will probably be quite different for different individuals. And then finally, I'm going to ask what could we do something about it? I'm going to use a very simple stochastic model of the labor market. We're going to estimate with labor market data that is very good, high quality from Germany, the social security system. So we have all coal workers who ever worked in German coal plants. And we're going to quantify the welfare costs, but only for the lignite workers. So this ignores the spillovers. So this is the multipliers that Natalia was talking about. This also ignores the fact that electricity prices might be affected. This also avoids talking about climate effects, etc. So we're thinking about the direct financial and monetary costs. And as I said, questions are, why is job loss costly? For whom is it most costly? A big discussion in Germany was, when should we exit coal? Everyone is more or less in agreement that we need to exit coal for climate reasons. The question is, how quick? So we're going to consider how these welfare costs for workers vary over the horizon of coal exit, and as I mentioned, the policy effects. I'm going to very briefly talk about the German coal industry, very, very briefly introduce the structural model with, I think, no equations at all, but there are lots of equations in the paper, and then discuss some results. So there's two types of coal in Germany. The black coal or hard coal is the dirty stuff deep down in the earth, mined in pits. This is the Billy Elliot full Monty kind of coal, bad for the climate, very dirty. And Germany exited the coal mining in 2018 and is currently continuing using it for electricity production, but importing it from other places, Russia and Colombia and things. Lignite is even more dirty and even worse for the climate, but it's mined in big open cast coal mines. And that is what we're talking about currently when we're talking about coal exit. It's mainly these jobs. The coal industry is actually quite large in Germany. It's as large as similar industry sizes of the UK, where we know a lot about the transition. And in lignite, we have it's a little bit less now, about 12,000 employees or so. We're talking about here the unmitigated welfare losses. There was a lot of transition policies for hard coal mining and for lignite mining. And I discuss these very briefly when I talk about policies, but what I'm talking about here is if the state hadn't done anything for these workers. And I think you'll understand why in a second. Coal mining is a big thing locally. This is Cologne, one of the largest cities in Germany, and this is an open cast lignite mine. So when we think about what is the welfare cost of losing your job, the way we think about it as saying, well, the value of a job is that you get a wage, you get an income stream, and you get it for a certain duration. We're going to approximate this stochastically and say there's some probability that you lose your job. If you don't lose your job, you continue receiving your wage every period. And if you do lose your job, you fall into unemployment, you get unemployment benefits for a specific period. We approximate the German welfare system where you first get for 12 months a higher unemployment benefit and then you fall down to a lower level. When you're unemployed, you might find a new job. This new job will have certain characteristics, again, these characteristics. And all of this we're going to look at for different types of individuals. So the formal education that Francesca just criticized as not being enough, but that's all we have in the data, unfortunately. Also age and also macroeconomic conditions. So currently we have fairly low unemployment throughout Germany, but in the past it was much higher. Now, if we think about, where does this welfare cost of losing your job come from? Well, fundamentally, in economics, we think, well, it's actually the fact that you don't immediately find a new job with the same characteristics, right? So the sort of perfect competition benchmark, if the world were, as economists sometimes think they should be, would be that there wouldn't be any welfare costs because you would immediately find a new job. Your wage would just depend on your productivity. Okay, so what we have is we have frictional unemployment. You need time to find a job. We have wage differences because people don't receive the same wage in different jobs. And it does matter how quickly you lose your job, because if you do lose your job, then you risk falling back into unemployment. So these are objects that we're going to estimate from the data. We're going to look at how long do people stay in unemployment, how quickly do they find a job. If they find a job, is it in coal or in non-coal sectors? We're going to look at the wage distributions of these different, for different workers in these different sectors. And then we're going to look at how secure these jobs are. So if you want to see, maybe this is the kind of equation. This is not a real equation. There's no Greek letters, but so this is the kind of idea. You have the value of a job. It's related to the income stream, and then there's a probability that you lose your job, and then you fall back to unemployment, but you lose your job. So yeah, more on demand. So let me head straight to the results. So what do we have here? We have here the value of a coal job. So that is, if you're in a job, this is what you earn, your discounted value of being in this job. It just seems like a big number. This is euros, but we know that wages are quite high and the probability of losing your job is quite low. When you're in unemployment, you also have a value. You have a value of the unemployment benefit and you have a value of finding another job, but this is a lot less. So losing your job creates a welfare loss on average of this fairly substantial figure. Now, what we asked at the very beginning was, well, what are the factors? What are the determining factors of this? So what we're going to do is we're going to say, well, what if we plugged in the same wage distribution for the people who out of unemployment find a new job? What if when you lose your job in coal, when you find a new job, it has the same wage? So that would be, there's just one wage in the economy, one wage distribution, and everyone draws from the same wage distribution. Well, then the welfare cost falls 17%. Yeah, because the value of coal doesn't change much because people don't lose their jobs often. So it's not really very relevant what they find when they do lose their job. But for the people who are unemployed, it is quite important. a larger effect we see when we say, well, when people find a new job out of unemployment, they keep it as long as coal workers keep their job. Yep, the same job loss probability, so the same job security. Then we find that the welfare cost drops by more than 58%. And the two together, so the fact that out of unemployment, if you were to find the same quality of wage and the same quality of job security, that's 97%. So the residual here is the frictional unemployment. So contrary to a lot of discourse in the press, in the media, and by politicians, unemployment is not the problem, at least not in Germany, and at least not at the moment. Right? The problem is coal pays high wages, and coal has good job security. Okay, problem or challenge. I'm going to skip this in the interest of time, but we find that it's not the oldest workers who have the greatest problems. It's the middle-aged workers, the prime-aged workers, let's say. Does later coal exit reduce costs? Yes. So all the important institutions, the OECD as well, I think, say we should exit coal by 2030. There was a big discussion in Germany between 2030 or 2038. And because the demographics of this industry is such that there are lots of workers who will retire, it is the case that the unmitigated welfare costs, if we don't do anything for these workers, which is not the case, but if we don't do anything, costs will fall quite a bit. Simply because the workforce, if we have no hires, the workforce reduces naturally quite strongly over this period. I'm nearly finished. Just one last slide on policy. So currently the program, what Germany is pursuing is basically subsidized early retirement. People get 5 years of income replacement over the age of 58. And we find this problematic for several reasons. The first reason is this mainly replaces firms' early retirement programs. So this is a transfer from state funds to the industry, at least to a significant extent. So this doesn't help workers as much as you could with public monies. Secondly, it's not great for the local economy. You keep the money consumption in the region, but there's other multiplier effects that if these people were working in local other manufacturing industries, they could probably contribute more. It's also probably psychologically not great for these people if with 58 the message is you don't have a perspective on the labor market. So what we're proposing is a wage insurance where we say, well, find another job in another industry, and we're going to pay the wage difference between the higher wage in the coal industry, which we saw was an important determining factor of the welfare costs, and the lower wage, presumably, in your new job. And I can show you wage distributions, the difference is quite great. So it's totally standard to have a difference of 30–50% wage between the coal industry and other industry. And if we do this, and then if we make some quite strong assumptions, but it's hard to know how to estimate what the effects would be, we find that you could probably, at fairly little costs, you could reduce the welfare costs quite strongly. And the reason is that people remain in the economy. You don't have to pay income replacement. You rather subsidize them moving to other industries. So we think, and there is a similar policy for unemployed workers, or there was in Germany, that unemployed workers were incentivized to take jobs that paid lower wages. But currently there isn't such a policy, and we think this might be a sensible policy also for other transitions. I guess the coal industry is not very favorable to this proposition, because that would probably mean that the best workers probably leave first. So that may be a political economy reason why it's not on the table very prominently. So let me conclude. What are the reasons for the cost of job loss? It's not unemployment. Coal pays well and has high job security. It's mainly the workers aged 30 to 49. This is the group of workers that gets nothing from the government. The government is subsidizing early retirement only for older workers. Does a later coal exit reduce welfare costs? Yes, it does, because the demographics is such, but this doesn't mean that currently workers are suffering, or that they would suffer more, because they're getting these benefits by getting early retirement subsidies. We think it would make more sense to subsidize new job opportunities rather than retirement. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Luke. So we're running a bit late, but we'll take a few more minutes so we can ask a couple of questions. We received a couple of them through the Q&A. So I'll start with one that we received for Natalia, and she already answered, but I'd like to see if you can say a little bit more about the results you showed on the results to 2030. You provided a sort of a simulation on the employment impact that you think will have with the additional impact, with the additional investments in renewables that will be needed to achieve the objectives to 2030 for Spain. So I was wondering, in that context, and also given the last presentation, which showed the other side of the energy sector, let's say, what do you think are the key implications for policymakers?
Thank you very much, Elisa. Let me clarify that my estimates are local jobs. So this doesn't mean that renewables will create few jobs. This is not something that I'm estimating, so I cannot really say anything about this. All I'm saying is that the jobs that remain within the municipalities where the investments are being made. Regarding policy, I think that we should focus on trying to provide benefits for the local residents, and this clearly has to do with the skills. As Francesca was discussing, this is a critical issue. Probably firms would like to employ more local workers. Simply, they cannot find the workers with the necessary skill in the rural municipalities where the investments take place. The Spanish government has been putting in place some measures to promote this. So, for instance, there's limited access to the local network available. So they are running like beauty contests by which they allocate this scarce capacity to those firms that propose to create more local jobs or to employ more local firms, and so on and so forth. So somehow, allocating these scarce resources, taking these local impacts into account. There's many other measures that could be considered. So local taxes, making local residents have stakes on these renewable projects, so that they feel not only that these investments are occupying their space where they live, but also providing some benefits in the form of profits out of these investments or lower energy cost, in a sense, make them feel that they are part of these investments and they can benefit from them.
Right, thanks very much. Any view of these results on local effects in Spain? I was wondering if, on the other hand, Luke had any idea of how the results that are more aggregate that you presented might affect local population differently. And we also had a question which asks about whether your results are influenced by the fact that maybe jobs are more unionized in Germany.
Sorry, can you repeat the end of the sentence?
The question was for you, Kat.
Oh, okay.
Sorry.
Apologies.
So yes, there's definitely a strong unionization. As I mentioned in the chat, that it's not a very competitive industry. So these lignite mines, there's no auctioning of the right to mine lignite. It's pretty intransparent how they get there into the mines, and they're very clever in redistributing their resource rents to workers, and the unions are very powerful in protecting the privileges of the workers. So it's very understandable. So you had the first question was on local multiplier effects? No.
Yes, I was just wondering, since the results, I found the results in Spain on the local effects quite interesting. You present more aggregate results, but if you could maybe infer, or do you have any idea how the employment effects could vary across the population?
So for other parts of the population, you mean, not the co-workers? So we're here focusing mainly on the co-workers' employment biographies, right? So we haven't looked here at other local employment effects. There will be some, however, they'll be quite muted because on the one hand, people are protected. So all these early retirement means that locally you get the same, they get income replacement, so they're still spending their money in the local shops. It's quite probably a long-term effect then.
Okay, thanks very much. We have another question on the chat, and I was wondering if Francesca has a view on this. The question is, to what extent digitalization and artificial intelligence policies would affect environmental policies in terms of employment?
I mean, there's a lot of talk about the twin transition, green and digital. I mean, from a skills perspective, many of the skills and many of the policies in terms of skills development that are useful to promote the digital transition are also being used to think about how to promote upskilling and reskilling for the green transition. The development of new technologies is at the core of that. At the moment, what we have seen in terms of young people's readiness for the twin transition is that the kids are very much unprepared, and those who have high levels of environmental awareness and high levels of computational thinking, for example, are the same kids who have high levels of scientific understanding and etc. Vice versa, the ones that miss one oftentimes miss the other. So the readiness of moving into one dimension oftentimes overlaps with the other. Now, moving forward, one of the things we are looking into is, particularly in the context of vocational education and training, the content of curricula, to try and understand more exactly what kind of changes in the curricula need to be implemented to reshape them so that new skills are taught and complement the ones that are already being taught. At the moment, there's a lot of fragmentation, and that's oftentimes you need an integration of the two.
Thanks a lot. I also had an additional question for Balázs. Your results basically seem to suggest that the employment effects of environmental policy stringency are not linear. So in that context, how do you think you can interpret the results in light of the need to very much increase the ambition of climate policies to reach the Paris Agreement?
Yes, thank you. So in the paper, we find no evidence of nonlinearity after multiple ways of checking, but I do believe nonlinearity is important, because if countries will be able to hold their pledges and transition to net zero by 2050, policy stringency has to increase non-linearly at least some point in time. And while there will be non-linear effects, I think, but perhaps the reason why we hadn't found them is it just not materialized. They haven't bitten so strong yet. And I think, to avoid the volatility of nonlinear effects, which, they can add nonlinear, volatility, clear communication and commitments are important. And these could decrease the uncertainty and enable companies to have kind of a longer term vision of these investments, for example, change production processes. And in terms of need to increase ambition, I think this also means that a steady and clear increase of stringency is better than sudden changes. In turn, this implies that the current level of stringency needs to be increased to avoid having to implement sudden, very stringencies in, I don't know, 2045.
Okay, thanks very much. I was wondering if our speakers would like to maybe share in a 1 minute each any final reflections or comments, also in view of the other presentations. Maybe we can follow the same order and start with Natalia.
Well, not much to say. I think all of them are very exciting projects. I was thinking also of starting a new project now that Luke has presented his project on the value of coal jobs. I will have to read that more carefully, but I was having the idea of also performing a similar exercise as the one I do, not on employment by renewals, but rather on the employment effects of the phase out of coal. In Spain, we have no more coal left. So there's a lot of cross-sectional and variation in the impact of in the phase out of the different coal plants across the national geography, and try to see how long it takes for these municipalities to really, if that is the case, start having new activity, and try to see whether there's any complementarity between. So in your paper, look, you have this value of the job also depends on the probability of finding a new job and the pay that you're gonna get in another job. So I think there, the complementarity between these two policies comes out very nicely, in the sense that if we manage to provide new activities to the areas where the coal plants are being phased out, then we are increasing this probability of finding a new job. We have to reskill them, of course, so these things come in that part of the equation, right? The probability depends on the new economic activity, and that could well be green activity, and the probability of finding a new job depends on whether they have the right skills, and that also affects the type of salary that you're gonna get. So if we manage somehow to measure the complementarity between the phase out of fossil fuel and the potential for the new activities to facilitate these phase outs, I think that would be very interesting, and I writing down for future research projects. Thank you.
Thanks a lot. Luke, do you maybe want to go next?
Well, congratulations on Spain for phasing out coal, first of all. Yes, no, I think it's really interesting. I think what I sometimes miss in the debate is sort of separating the effects for the workers from the effects for the regions and the effects for the industries. And I think that's not a coincidence. I think the industry has a strong interest in conflating all of these and saying, we are the industry, we are the region, we are the people working here. And I think as independent academics, it's really important for us to be clear on where we can compensate workers quite easily. It's fairly cheap compared to compensating firms for lost profits. At least, that's one of it's on the same order of magnitude. And then the regions is a more specific challenge, and I think it makes a lot of sense what Natalia said, is trying to figure out what you can provide the regions, and it's important to be clear that there are long-term welfare effects. Probably, and yeah, be transparent on it. And I clearly, in the long run, as a labor economist, we don't think that it's likely that there's going to be a strong unemployment effect, right? That there'll be new industries, and there's lots of need for workers in the transition towards a zero carbon economy. Thanks.
Thank you. Balázs?
Thank you. So just a quick final thought. I think I just would like to underline Francesca's presentation. I think it's very, it's very often when we discuss these issues, we say, okay, our economy is gonna, economic performance is gonna decrease a bit, but at least we're gonna get some clean environment. But there's work at the OECD, and there's academic work that air pollution decreases productivity, heat waves decrease productivity. Floods, in Germany recently destroyed a lot of infrastructure, and water pollution increases utility costs, which will flow downstream. So it's actually what we're trading off is short-term costs to long-term benefits. And I think this is very important to underline. Thank you.
Thanks, Balázs. Francesca?
Yeah, I think for me the big concern is on distributional implications. Thinking about how environmental conditions do not necessarily have the same effects because different individuals have different opportunities to insulate themselves. I often think about skills, and people often think about skills in terms of purely, let's say, cognitive skills, the ability to do a job. Before doing this work, I did quite a lot of work on migration, very different kind of subject. But economic concerns are often, no, I know that there are.
I'm simply saying that it's not that different. Yeah. There's many issues that are common. Yeah.
Yeah, and I think, one common thread that I don't know if you were thinking about those lines, but it's that people often think about, negative out-of-group attitudes are shaped by economic concerns, right? Migrants will get our jobs and etc. But we shouldn't underestimate the cultural and identity concerns. And one of the things that Luke's presentation made me think a lot about is, yes, we think about the value of a job in terms of, current income, opportunity not to get into unemployment, etc. But we shouldn't underestimate the long-term investment we need in creating new sense of identity. And that's really where a lot of the work, particularly in initial education and training, should give us, but also vocational education and training, should equip individuals also with a new identity. I'm not a coal miner anymore. I am part of something else. And this something else is great. And this sense of community is often what drives people's decisions, maybe not even to accept a job that may pay marginally better, because they have a community and they have a sense of identity.
Thank you very much to the four of you for a very nice session and very nice wrap-up comments. It's been very good to see the complementarities across the presentations. And thanks very much to everybody who's attending and who's listening in. So that marks the end of the session, and I'll pass on to Tomasz Kozluk, who will go on with the last session for the day.
Hello. Okay, I don't know if you can hear me. Well, hello and welcome everybody. So I have the pleasure of chairing the session on the social and distributional impacts of environmental policies. My name is Tomasz Kozluk. I work at the OECD Economics Department. And frankly, it looks like a session that's really exciting, important topic, excellent speakers. So let me just start with saying that, well, you've heard a lot about the environmental impacts on innovation and employment in the previous sessions. Right now, we'll focus more on the social and distributional impacts. We know that there's a lot of empirical evidence showing that stringent environmental policies they've brought about significant or sizable environmental benefits over the years, at least some of them. We know that they haven't brought huge economic effects on the aggregate, but we also know that if you scratch below that, I mean, both the distributional impacts on firms and people have been more diverse. We also have seen that the thing of being either losing out from environmental policies or perceiving yourself as a potential loser out from environmental policies, but also not feeling that one benefits enough from the environmental benefits from the policies can be a serious constraint to implementing further more stringent environmental policies. So this is something that can really stem progress towards our environmental objectives, environmental goals. Fortunately, there's a lot of interesting research in this area, and we'll be hearing some of the very interesting stuff from our speakers today. So to spare time, I think I'll just remind maybe the housekeeping rule. So I'll be introducing the speakers one by one as they appear. I'll be giving 10 minutes to speakers. That's what the organizers told me, and apparently you have to be quite strict on that. So I'll be, trying to interfere after the 10 minutes, if that's okay with you guys. I'm sorry. I think after every speaker, there's always time to ask some clarifying questions, but we'll try to leave the bigger questions for broader discussion at the end. I hope that's okay with everybody. So to start off with, I'll introduce the first speaker. This is Professor Francesco Vonna, who is an applied economist at the University of Milan. He's also a director of the program Labor in Low Carbon Transition at FIM, Fondazione Enrico Mattei, and a research fellow at the French Economic Observatory of Sciences Po. And I've actually known Francesco for a while, so I know it's always great to listen to him. So Francesco, the floor is yours.
Hi Thomas, nice to see you, and thanks for the invitation and the nice introduction. Well, today I'm going to speak about a report that I wrote for the OECD on distributional effect. It's a broad overview. Actually, I will speak more about labor, so I think it's not we don't leave labor entirely to the last session, because among the distributional effect, labor market distributional effects are among the most important. So I want just to give 2 slides to summarize a bit the finding of this report. First of all, what's happening here? Okay, so first of all, in the report, I kind of summarize the state of the art, of course, on distributional effect, and I do it around posing this question: is the regressivity of distributional effect? Here I want to focus on climate policy, not to make confusion between environmental and climate policy, so carbon tax, cap and trade, subsidies to green energy. I will call them green subsidies in a more general way. Well, what we know about the distributional effect of this type of policies, and we know that they are, first of all, multidimensional, and there will be other speakers speaking about perhaps more about other dimensions. And we know the following. First, we know that these normally a carbon tax is regressive on spending, because it increases the prices proportionally more for goods that are basic needs, okay, that satisfy basic needs. And is in a way is progressive on labor and capital. I mean, it's progressive because it increases the demand of labor with respect to the demand of capital. This is the finding I would say more than the finding, the assumption of several CGE models. I will discuss about this assumption, but this CGE model, they tend to find that the progressive effect more than offset the regressive effect. Okay, so this is a good news. The second main finding is that the distributional effects are progressive, even very progressive in terms of health co-benefits, and these co-benefits are related to are highly persistent and are related to the accumulation of human capital and to intergenerational transmission of human capital, and so they are particularly important. Third, what we know is that it's difficult to rank different instruments in terms of their distributional effect. However, we have quite enough evidence to say that green subsidies, so I mean subsidies to green energy, are more regressive than carbon taxes or cap and trade or emission standards. Then fourth, at least theoretically, we have several possible offsetting policies that can be used to offset these regressive distributional effects. And among these theoretically, these offsetting policies work, all of them work, and they are, lump sum redistributions, financing green projects, environmental tax reform, but they are very different in terms of political acceptability, and I will go back to this later. So from a pure economic point of view of distributional effect, it is unclear why there is widespread opposition to climate policy, unless one cannot think that everything is about lack of international cooperation or about lobbying or about misperception. Obviously, these are very important, but what I want to suggest here is that there are some structural factors that are also very important. Okay, so which are the structural factors that in a way make everything more complicated, and by more complicated I mean more regressive, okay, so more unfair. Okay, so the first aspect is that adjustment takes time. Okay, so basically we cannot evaluate the distributional effect only in the short term. We have to look at the long-term effect, and the long-term effect became more regressive simply because the poor households are financially constrained, and so actually even if you offer them a subsidy for an electric vehicle, they don't have enough money to co-finance the electric vehicle. And there is this nice paper that everybody I think knows about green subsidies in the US, how they are regressive, and there are several others also for Europe now. Then there are less obvious examples. I mean, for instance, retraining, we spoke out about retraining before, but we have to bear in mind that retraining can be very regressive if there is not a kind of welfare state that provide not only enough retraining, I mean, opportunities to displace worker, but also protect the worker while unemployed. Okay, so if they don't have enough time to be retrained, the worker have to accept low-skilled jobs, and this is a bit the difference between the US and the European labor market. Then we have other dynamics that make everything more regressive, all the literature on environmental gentrification, housing prices, migration. So these are other examples. So the second aspect is, again, we spoke about this, but I want to stress it more. There is a special concentration of the loser. So special inequality can be exacerbated, and I want to mention some of our research with Giovanni, Marina, and David Top about for instance, which is the locational Gini coefficient of a brown job, so a job in brown energy compared to a green job, and is 0.72, means that is near the maximum of 1 for a brown job compared to 0.31 for a green job. Moreover, community that are intensive of high carbon region, let's call them intensive of high carbon activities, are poorer than average normally, like diversification, and exhibit a long-term declining trend that predate the implementation of ambitious climate policy, and is related to other structural transformations. So the third aspect is preferences. Well, preferences make everything more complicated because normally environmental improvements, or let's say environmental quality, is considered a good that is higher in the hierarchical scale. So preferences are basically non-homothetic, so depend on income. So what does it mean? That if we improve the environment, a person with low income will value this less than a person with high income. Whether this is related to misperception or not, there is a huge debate. I don't want to enter on this, but this is a matter of fact that has been found in very influential strands of literature. This is exacerbated by spatial interaction, because if people tend to live in the same neighborhood and you live near your friends are people that have preferences, green attitude, you become greener, as the literature on the diffusion of PV panel has shown in both in the US and in Germany. But instead, if you live near people that are climate skeptic, you're going to self-reinforce this dynamic through social interaction. Okay. So, now I want to, so this is the framework. So actually in this report, I'm a bit more pessimistic than this conclusion of, let's say, the CGA model. And I want to show you some reason why I'm more pessimistic. The first reason is about what happened in the labor market. Okay, so I've been doing lots of research in the labor market with my usual team, David, Giovanni, and so on. And so I want to present some of this stuff. Okay, so there are why the adjustment in the labor market is less smooth than predicted by CGA model. Well, the first reason is that capital is a better substitute for energy than labor, and using shocks on energy prices and let's say the updated version of shift share instrumental variable design, taking into account of all the trick of pre-trends and stuff like that. We show that, and excellent data from French level data, we show that climate policy shock exacerbate accelerate capital, okay, both in the short and in the long term. Second, green technology are often skill biased, and they are biased against manual workers, and especially in favor of technical and engineering workers. Third, if you think about the reallocation that occurred in other structural transformations, so there was a decline in employment in manufacturing, where these unskilled people employed in manufacturing find the job. They find normally the job in a sector that is low productivity, unregulated, and so low unionized sector, and this the low skilled service sector. Okay, so this is the story of the China shock. Is the story of the job-polarization literature, so the literature related to automation. And as we know from the new literature on populism, this has created, has been behind, a key factor behind the increase in populism in both Europe and in the US. Okay, so using the lesson from these shocks that increase inequality and were not well managed, can we do something better for the green transition? So can we reallocate workers instead than reallocating them from high carbon manufacturing to the low skilled service sector to create high-paid green jobs in wind turbines or in engineering services for the green transition. Is it possible? What are the challenges and how these people working in this sector are paid? So I want to show you very quickly a bit of evidence from recent research. Here is research on the universe of job vacancy data for the US. And here we measure the skill gap between green low carbon jobs and non-low carbon jobs within specific occupation. And actually the main finding is that we confirm that there is a gap in terms of technical skill. That is something that we found in previous research using other data, less granular data, but we also find that the gap in terms of skills for all the key occupation for the green transition. Here I mentioned 5, but they are the most important: construction and extraction workers, engineer, installation and maintenance worker. There is a skill gap for green jobs. So green jobs require more skill, not only technical skills, but also cognitive skills, IT skills, managerial skills, etc., etc. The second point is that unfortunately, the job offer, the wage offer in this job, I mean, this is just the demand side. So bear in mind, it's just the demand side, nothing is causal. So is there a wage premium for this excess of skill that these jobs require? Well, there was a bit of wage premium at the beginning of the decade in 2010, 2020, after the push of the Obama stimulus package, but then this wage premium fade away. Okay, so actually we don't observe any wage premium for within the similar occupation for being in green jobs. So this is something that makes green jobs less attractive, perhaps. Okay, instead we find a wage premium that is quite large for high carbon job, and this resonates the presentation on Germany. Last, we using yet another type of data, census data. We asked in a recent piece of research whether the people that have the skills that are required for performing these green jobs, so the STEM workers, so science, technology, engineering worker, are paid more or less in green jobs compared to different positions. So we know the degree of these people, the field of study, and we know in which occupation they are employed in a very detailed way. So we estimate this wage premium using usual mean serial regression, controlling for lots of factors. And you see that the highest ranked occupation for STEM is finance. The second highest ranked is STEM jobs working in degrees, graduate working in STEM occupation. And there is a big gap with the STEM workers working in green jobs, which is the green line here. Okay, so actually, perhaps even if the green jobs are able to attract STEM workers, they are not able to attract the best of them, and so this can create a gap also in terms of the innovation capacity of the country. So the second zoom is about which type of policy we can do for improving all this. Well, I didn't speak about Green Deal plan, and in the report there is a debate about the distributional effect of the Green Deal plan. And actually, after writing the report, I found this very nice paper of Bergquist et al., I think Nature Climate Change, where they show that the political acceptability of green spending package is much higher. Of course, it's polarized, depend on political ideology and blah, 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 but it's much higher when these packages are combined with specific labor market interventions, such as a minimum wage and retraining programs. Okay, so actually the question is, actually this is justified by evidence, who are the winner and loser of these plans, and how large are fiscal multiplier? Obviously, the larger they are, the more they self-pay themselves. So, and we go back to the recent evaluation of the Obama green stimulus package, where we have two main findings that in a way corroborate this research of that is more on the political acceptability of Bergquist et al., which are the following. First, the green stimulus package is much more effective in areas with more green skills, with the workforce that have the right skills to transit to green jobs, and the effect is 40% larger than in the average community. And actually, if we want to kind of generalize how this finding has been followed by governments around the world, I just go through the OECD database on green fiscal policies. I just count the number of green policies that are under discussion in several countries, which are the ones that are under discussion and are retaining policies, and they are just 2% of the policy under discussion. So there is, I mean, we know that these investments are very effective, but we don't do it. Okay, we don't they are not a priority in the discussion of the green stimulus package. Then the second finding is that we found a big tension between two dimensions of inequality. On the one hand, a green stimulus package benefit communities that are abundant of green skills that are also wealthier. So this can exacerbate special inequalities. We find something similar in a recent work for Europe. And we also find, however, that most jobs that are created are manual jobs, especially in construction sector. So these are going to offset the skill bias that we found for manufacturing, that with this shift in favor of middle skill technical occupation and against manual jobs. But we don't find a wage growth, which confirms the fact that the construction sector is less unionized than the manufacturing, so there is less rent to share for the worker. Okay.
If you could slowly start, concluding. I'm sorry.
Yeah. Okay, I conclude. Just to show you two more slides. One slide is about how we can take stock for this with a simple indicator. So, for instance, in our paper, we build a map where we have the region with the high employment of fossil fuel, and we have in green we have how green skills there are in the workforce, and if there is an overlapping, so like here, is good, because the workforce can be reemployed from fossil fuel to green sectors more easily than in regions like the Appalachian, where there is no such overlapping. Okay, so to conclude, the third kind of zoom in is about whether is enough to manage the distributional effect of climate policies, or we need something more. I mean, there is a problem here that thinking that there are only the distributional effect of climate policies that matters for political acceptability is very limiting. Okay, why is very limiting? Because there is a first order effect that is related to the level of inequality, not to the change of inequality. And this is related to the fact that preferences are normothetic. So with preferences that are normothetic, the lower is, for a given level of income per capita, the lower is inequality, the wealthier is the median voter, and the more support there is for more stringent climate policies. This is not causal. In a couple of papers, we show this not causally, but now there is a causal evidence on this, of this recent paper of Betts, Bosetti, and Colantone, that shows that the China shock, which increased inequality, reduced the support for green parties and reduced green attitude toward climate change in both Europe and in the US. So there is a kind of big last question, and I finish. The last big question is the following: is the low carbon transition feasible without reducing the level of inequality? Of course, there is one negative answer, is that it's not, because actually, if the level of inequality dominate over the effect on political acceptability of distributional effect, is not. But it's also true that there is now a literature that is increasing in size on place-based policies, or the literature on which is the policy toolkit to create good middle-skill jobs, like Roderick and Sancheva. All this literature started to identify a set of policies that are useful for creating these middle-skill jobs. And one policy that are very effective in both literature is, again, sector-specific training programs that are both enhancing the economic effectiveness of spending, but also reducing inequality by creating middle-skill jobs. And I conclude. Sorry for having been a bit long.
No. Thanks, Francesco. Just one, since we are allowed for clarification questions, I guess the big challenge is low carbon transition feasible without increasing the level of inequality, right?
Without reducing. We should reduce the inequality, because we for a given level of income per capita, the median household will be wealthier. If preferences are normothetic, this median household will care more about the environment, and so will support more voting for environmental policies. And there is evidence that this effect of the level of inequality or the general inequality are first order effect, because in this recent paper of Betts et al., I think now is forthcoming in climate change, and I think is going to, they show that the effects are pretty big. Okay, so actually it's quite surprising because they are not trying to identify the effect of the China shock on the preferences for trade policies, like a spillover effect on other policies. Okay, because the China shock is unrelated to environmental policies, also because it affects mostly sectors that are not very carbon intensive. Okay, so like textile and stuff like that.
Okay, thanks a lot. And it's time for our next speaker, who's, let me welcome Professor Joseph Shapiro from the University of California, Berkeley. He's a professor in agriculture and resource economics and the Department of Economics. He also serves as associate editor for Journal of Political Economy and co-editor for the Journal of Public Economics and a research associate at NBER and Energy Institute at Haas. And Joseph, I haven't met, so I don't know him, but I remember a while ago, the OECD Epoch chair sent me his paper, and it was a very interesting paper. So I look forward, Joseph, to your presentation.
Thanks very much. I'm delighted to be here, and thank you for inviting me and organizing this. I'm going to tell you about some joint research I've been doing with Reid Walker, who's also from UC Berkeley. This is about one specific paper, but I'll mention a few others. And we think about this as discussing two concepts. One concept is environmental markets. Those are policies like cap and trade markets or pollution taxes. They're cost effective. In other words, for a given amount of cost, they maximize the reduction in pollution. So they're very an effective, efficient kind of way of reducing pollution. And they're an alternative to standards, which just prescribe every polluting source has to achieve the same environmental benefit. So that's one concept we're discussing, environmental markets. The other concept we're thinking about is environmental justice. That's a constellation of ideas, but generally it's the thought that environmental policy should be inclusive, participatory, respectful, should include fair treatment of all groups, and it should lead to equitable environmental outcomes. The broad concern motivating the environmental justice movement is that if you look at air pollution, drinking water pollution, surface water pollution, or other environmental goods, there tend to be patterns in many countries and time periods and data sets that you find higher pollution levels in low-income communities and communities of color. And that motivates this movement to try to equalize processes and outcomes. So this research that I'm discussing is about the intersection of these two. It's about a concern of how environmental markets interact with environmental justice. Environmental markets, unlike standards, do not prescribe or guarantee pollution levels in different communities. And that leads to the concern that environmental markets may have adverse impacts on environmental justice. That's been an important political concern in several states' climate change policies in the US. There was also a debate about potential appointment of Mary Nichols, a climate leader, to head the US Environmental Protection Agency. And some of the opposition came out of concern for how California had dealt with interactions between environmental markets and environmental justice. We're going to look at this interaction in one very specific context, which is one of the oldest and largest environmental markets in the US. It's a set of markets, we call them offset markets. Technically, they're called emissions reductions credits. It's a set of policies that's been under the US Clean Air Act since the 1970s. There are over 500 markets under these policies. And the way they operate is that if you want to open a large polluting plant in a metro area, you have to find an existing plant emitting the same kind of pollution in the same metro area and compensate that plant so that they reduce their emissions. So you're opening a steel mill in Pittsburgh, you have to find an existing plant in Pittsburgh and pay them to reduce their pollution so that there's no net increase in that pollutant in that city. This is an environmental market because it has bilateral payments to decrease pollution. And we have a pair of papers. The one I'm going to talk about today is about equity. We also have another paper looking at efficiency. We want to ask, when this market allows pollution to relocate from an incumbent plant, which is decreasing emissions, to a new entering plant, which is increasing emissions, it's the same pollutant in the same metro area. Is this market disproportionately moving or relocating pollution to low-income communities or communities of color? We're going to focus on 12 markets in 2 states, California and Texas, that have the richest data. Our companion paper on efficiency is able to look at many more markets because it doesn't have quite the fine-grained geographic resolution. Our broad takeaway here is that we don't find substantial evidence this market has changed for better or worse the distribution of pollution. It's tending to move pollution between communities with similar income levels and similar shares of households that are African American or Latino or other racial minority groups. And you could see that as good, that economically efficient environmental policies don't have adverse inequality impacts. Or you could see it as bad, as saying that the existing distribution of pollution is unequal and existing policy tools don't change it. So let me briefly show you how we obtain these conclusions from this set of markets, and then say something more broadly about what we take from this, about how environmental markets interact with environmental justice. This is a picture the US Environmental Protection Agency created in the 1970s to illustrate exactly how these markets work. They sound similar to a cap and trade market, but technically by textbook definition, they're different, they're offset markets. I could go into the differences in 10 minutes, I won't, I'll just say it's like a first cousin of cap and trade market designs. So imagine there's an existing polluting factory that's emitting 200 tons of pollution per year, and they find some technology that lets them clean up most of that pollution. So now they're emitting only 60 tons. They get a certificate, technically an ERC, an emissions reductions credit, which say you have reduced pollution more than regulation requires. There's 140 tons additional pollution reduction. They can sell that certificate to a new opening factory. In this example, that's firm B. In this hypothetical example, they buy that pollution and pay the incumbent $150 per ton. This new factory emits pollution, and in net, pollution hasn't really increased in the city. If anything, it's slightly decreased through this transaction. What we want to ask is, let's look at the community surrounding firm A and the community surrounding firm B and ask if they have different shares of households that are low income, African American, or other racial minority groups. This is just one example of many of the transactions we look at. This is a real live offset emission reduction credit. It's from a manufacturing plant in the area of Houston, Texas. It's called ScanPack Manufacturing. They installed a pollution control technology called a thermal oxidizer. It decreased their emissions of volatile organic compounds, which is a nasty category of pollutants. And then they sold the certificate to Enterprise Products, a totally separate company that invests in oil and gas, for several $1 million. And the kind of question we're going to ask is, ScanPack, the community that decreased pollution, are they located in a low-income community, or are they polluting a low-income community? Then let's look at Enterprise Products and ask, what are the demographics of their neighborhoods, and how do these two compare? Is pollution disproportionately moving to or away from low-income and minority communities? This is a map showing all the communities where these markets operate, but again, we're just focusing on a narrow subset of these markets where we have detailed enough data to look at demographics. So here's a set of results. I'll just show it in a few pictures. They're all going to tell a pretty similar story. This is a density graph, which shows 2 lines. The dashed line is showing the neighborhoods where pollution decreased because plants invested in pollution control and sold offsets. And the solid line is showing demographics of communities where pollution increased because there's a new opening plant or a modification. These lines are showing the share of people in each community who have a particular demographic. Here we're showing the share of households that identify as Black or African American. And you can see these 2 lines overlap fairly well. The vertical lines show the mean of the places where pollution decreases and where it increases. You know, in some areas, one density is a little higher, in other areas, it's a little lower, but the mean and the median are very similar. And statistically, we can't reject the hypothesis that the source and the destination plants have the same demographics in their area. So that's the share of households that are Black or African American. This graph shows the share of households that identify as Hispanic. Again, you see the same pattern where the densities are not exactly the same. There is a slightly higher share of households of communities that are less than 10% Hispanic in one set of plants and a slightly higher share in another set, but broadly they're statistically indistinguishable. The mean and the median are quite similar. Finally, we see something similar if you look at the distribution of household incomes. Again, there is a slight shift. It's not statistically significant. These distributions are broadly similar. And just to reiterate once more what these lines mean, It means if you look at factories where pollution is decreasing because of these markets, and then you look at the factories where pollution is increasing because the factories are buying the right to emit pollution, those two factories are in neighborhoods with similar demographics. They do have higher poverty levels and higher minority communities than the average community in the country or the city, but the places where pollution is moving from and to have similar distributions. I'm just going to sum up. This is just one paper, and our research talks about other papers that have done related analyses for other markets. And in some markets, one finds the markets are moving pollution towards low-income and minority communities. In other markets, people have obtained the opposite conclusion. Pollution is moving away from low-income and minority communities. Our broad takeaway is that there's no systematic evidence that efficient market-based environmental policies are especially good or bad for inequality. And once again, you could take that as good news, as saying, look, this would suggest you can invest in effective, efficient ways of improving the environment without adversely impacting inequality. Of course, the flip side of that is that low-income minority communities are more polluted to begin with. And so neither standards nor market-based policies are substantially changing that distribution. Okay, I'm in about 10 minutes, so I'll say thanks for listening. I look forward to discussion.
Thank you very much, Joseph, and thanks a lot for sticking with the time. If there's no clarification questions, I'll move to the next speaker. So let me introduce Irina Dorband, who is an economist at the World Bank at the Equitable Growth, Finance and Institutions practice group of the World Bank. She specialized in distributional and consumption employment impacts of climate fiscal reforms and their integration in country operations. She is also a main author of several journal articles on equity and political economy aspects of climate change mitigation and coal phase-out politics. So Irina, the floor is yours.
Thank you so much, Thomas. And thank you very much for the invitation. I'm quite honored to be speaking here today. I hope you can see my slides and you can hear me. Yes, I'm seeing nodding. Thank you so much, Joe. So I would like to speak about climate policy today a little bit more from the perspective of low-income countries, which I think within this workshop haven't been addressed quite so much. And in doing so, I would like to speak about climate policies more, let's say, from a broader policy point of view, and really think of them as an integral part to broader development policy. And especially I will focus therefore on fiscal policies towards sustainable development paths. Now, first, I guess I'll pick up a little bit where Caroline left off yesterday, and with a view on the consumption and revenue use incidence of climate fiscal reforms, and emphasize that the horizontal heterogeneity may really present opportunities for more structural support to households than through, let's say, lump sum cash transfers. Then secondly, I'll present a little bit of our work on the sectoral employment effects. And here I would really like to emphasize that it's important to look at these from a whole of the economy perspective. And finally, drilling down into those, I will speak a little bit more about the distributional effects across occupations and income groups. And what I would like to emphasize here is that it is really contingent on policy design. So outcomes depend on policies. And now, of course, in the context that we're working in lower income countries, there's quite a little ex post evidence. So how do we get to all of these results? It's with models. I will present the two models that we have built to provide such ex ante policy advice to the countries, and also some use examples. So let's go to the consumer incidents very first. So carbon taxes or carbon price increases are often thought of regressive. Francesco also reiterated that already. In this case, what you're seeing is the consumption incidence of a domestic $60 carbon tax and a full reform of that country's existing fossil fuel subsidies, and this is without revenue recycling. And what we're comparing here is the incidence, the average incidence on the bottom 40% of the income distribution and the top 60% of the income distribution. And so that means that the countries above the bar, above the line, are seeing in this measure a progressive incidence of consumption, meaning that the poorer households relative to their income are less affected than richer households. And from this graph, though, I would draw two overall conclusions, which is one, even such a quite fundamental carbon price reform has manageable effects across most countries. And the incidence really clusters along the neutrality line. However, there are some that are slightly progressive and some that are slightly regressive, with notably the regressive ones being more in the high income country spectrum. However, there's some countries which have carbon intensive economies and also highly subsidized economies, and those households in those countries may be affected a little bit more. Now, if we drill down into a specific country example, now here I'm using the example of Cote d'Ivoire, and Caroline also alluded to this already yesterday. There's, of course, large heterogeneity of the incidence within income groups. So one refers to that as the horizontal distribution. And the point that I would like to make here is that it may make it quite difficult to target these households very specifically. Again, particularly in countries which have, let's say, lower administrative capacities, and there climate fiscal reforms really provide an opportunity to raise revenues towards SDGs. And this might also alleviate some of the concerns that Francesco just voiced, that actually in the long term, the effects may be even more aggressive, because if we use the revenues for structural support, so for example, towards electricity access, that actually benefits mostly the poor, and then among the poor, the rural poor. I would really like to emphasize that it's important to think about development and climate synergetically. Then finally, let me turn to the employment effects, and we've heard already quite a lot in the first session and in quite a lot of depth. So once again, I would like to emphasize that it's important that to look really at this from a whole of the economy perspective. And what we've already heard, and Thomas, you already also said that in the introduction, maybe the overall employment effects that we see are expected to be small or neutral. However, there's a lot of sectoral heterogeneity hidden underneath. And I would like to here illustrate that using the example of Pakistan. So what this shows is sectoral labor demand changes from a $5 carbon tax, plus again, a full reform of Pakistan's fossil fuel subsidies. And we're using the revenues to cut income taxes or for targeted cash transfers that can be interpreted similarly for renewables investment and to increase government spending. And of course, it's a small reform. So what we see is also that it has small labor demand effects overall. However, there's quite a lot of heterogeneity across the whole economic spectrum between sectors. Now, in this case, what we're modeling is a proportional increase of government spending. However, now if we change that policy design, also the sectoral effects may look quite different. So in this graph, we're targeting government spending more towards, let's say, sectors of development interest. So education, health, production of staples, and also public transport. And what we see is that across sectors, the labor demand changes are a little bit different. So agricultural sectors are are seeing an increase in absolute terms, at least, of labor demand, and then also the health and social work sector is being increased. Now, importantly, of course, first of all, this has ramifications for workers and livelihoods employed in these sectors. And I think Luke really very strongly made that point already. However, of course, it also has implications, and Francesco has elaborated on that as well, on sectoral, no, that's wrong, on skill level needs. So which skills are needed in such a, let's say, new economic state? And we can see here that in the agricultural sector, it's mostly low-skilled workers. In health and also education sectors, it's mostly high-skilled workers. So of course, when we look further, drill down further into the types of occupations that may then be needed, we can see that in the first example, where governments, increase spending proportionately, elementary occupations see a small increase, albeit these changes are really small because it is a small reform. And also agricultural workers are in higher demand. However, if we then look at or compare this to a policy where the government focuses on these specific sectors, we can see that actually skilled occupations are seeing a greater demand increases than non-skilled occupations, so professional technicians and also skilled agricultural workers. Now, of course, one can say, oh, this is regressive because it will hit the higher income groups more. Another perspective would be that I guess we prefer is that if countries are proactively working towards the transformations that are needed in their economies, both to achieve climate goals and to achieve the sustainable development goals, they will have an opportunity to restructure, and this is very much what Francesca emphasized before, to restructure their educational and vocational, but also their labor market support in ways that proactively train workers in these new skill demands. Now, of course, this also translates across the income spectrum. Here again, I would just like to make that point that in this example, it's quite neutral, to be honest, but there is differences depending on policy design. And finally, this is also a gender aspect. Now in Pakistan, the labor force seems to be quite male-dominated overall. However, the sectors that may see increased demand, and also Francesco had a graph already on this with the skill mismatches. Some of these sectors like construction and manufacturing, etc., they're quite male-dominated. So that is in the short term an issue for gender equity, but in the longer term, maybe it could also be an opportunity to incentivize more non-traditional female sectors to employ more females. So finally, to conclude, I would like to emphasize that outcomes vary by country and they vary by policy design. And I think this conference has done a really good job in that they need to be considered comprehensively beyond the consumption effect. And if they're considered comprehensively, it could be that they're more progressive. However, in order to really make sure that the transition is achieved in an inclusive and, let's say, least frictional manner, it is extremely important to know beforehand who might be affected in which ways. And that is why we see a need for ex-ante policy advice. And there I would like to take the opportunity to briefly introduce these two models that we're using here. So the first one is the carbon pricing assessment tool. It's a joint project between the World Bank and the IMF. It's an Excel spreadsheet, which really is very user-friendly. It allows very tailored climate fiscal policy scenarios. And on the distributional side here, we model the consumption incidence across various socioeconomic groups and the revenue use incidence. And this will actually be publicly available soon. We've been saying that for a while, but I think it will actually happen very soon. And secondly, for the sectoral employment and also competitiveness effects, we built a multi-regional input-output model with price endogenous technology. The reason why we're not using CGE is that we have some reason to think that economies, particularly low-income economies, are not always at full capacity, and there may not be too big of a labor-leisure trade-off. There may be involuntary unemployment, so we're choosing to use this model, which is still in development. And we introduce in the input-output structure various adjustment effects that allow us to show the second and third order spillover effects across countries. So it also has an cross-border aspect, but also along global value chains. And here we inform the occupational, income, and gender distributional effects. And we also have then using microdata, we can inform some of the spatial differences. Just to show some examples, so the World Bank is currently conducting a whole fleet of country climate development reports. I also included a link down there if you're interested in. This is just an example of some of the work that we've done in this context. And herewith, I'd like to thank you. Thanks.
Thank you very much, Ira, and thanks a lot for a great presentation. It's very good to hear that CPET will be publicly available soon also, yeah, though I have heard that before. But thank you very much. And it's time for our last, but not least, panel speaker. But before that, I just want to say there's questions already appearing in the chat. If you have questions, I encourage you to post them and then we can use them for the discussion. But now I'll give the floor to Vincent Marcus, who is a Deputy Director on Economy and Evaluation at the French Ministry for Ecological Transition. He started his career at the French National Institute of Statistics, INSEE, and then moved to the Ministry of Ecology and the Ministry of Agriculture in various positions, including Head of Economic Analysis and public policies design and assessment unit. So as I understand, Vincent will be giving us some more real life examples from his French experiences. Vincent, the floor is yours. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Chair, and thank you very much for the invitation. Very glad to be here. Shall I share my screen, or Nicolina, will you do it for me? Okay, nice. Yeah, well, I'm also let's say a native economist, but I tend to be a more policymaker side, so perhaps more closer to the real life, as you said. Well, I will just pick up, in fact, two recent examples in French environmental policies and draw some lessons and experiment from that. For next slide, perhaps, just on the energy tax and carbon tax subject, just a few graphs and figures to set the scene, because of course I think everyone knows that. Indeed, direct energy consumptions and so taxes also on those consumptions are strongly regressive along income groups. You can see that on the left hand graphs. With the dark full line on the screen, but it's only part of the story, in fact, because within income groups you have also very large and significant heterogeneity, and you see that on the right hand graphs with the little orange and green squared showing the third and the first quartile of the distribution. So you can see that within the lowest income groups, you have in fact very much larger heterogeneity than between income groups for some extent. Next slide. This is due, of course, for various reasons, but just to explore two of them. on the left-hand side, you have the heterogeneity for housing bills and road fuels bills, and of course the expenditure in let's say road fuels, transport fuels are larger, 3 times larger in terms of heterogeneity. Is the right bar you see on the graphs, and of course on the main perhaps dimension explaining and driving heterogeneity in expenditures is the place you live in, and along the rural urban IRA dimension, I would say, you see on the right graphs, you see also a decreasing, quite strongly decreasing share of these expenditure in the income level. So when you mix that up, you come up with our yellow jacket crisis. So just to remind you that in the late 2018, we had a quite strong social contest regarding the increasing of the carbon tax. It's easily understood because, as you see here, you see that in the rural areas and within the lowest income groups, and so it's the green bar on the left hand of the graphs, you have almost 50% of those households from these groups that belong to the most impacted households. Means that the highest impact on the carbon tax increase. So you understand the roots. So perhaps for Francesco Vonna, from a pure economics perspective, it was unclear why climate policies don't work. But from a policymaker perspective, it's rather clear, I must say. Perhaps I think three main reasons to explain the failure of what happened at that time. First, we had an external shock. Let's say it was a time of increase in energy prices, not due to fiscal or tax increase, but just the overall conjuncture, economic demand, and so on. And that was, in fact, the most driver of the increase in the energy prices. But there was also a tax, and it was the first time that the carbon tax raised interest in public opinion, because in the previous years, in fact, this carbon tax increased slowly, but this increase was only phased out, in fact, by the general decrease in energy price until 2018. And perhaps the two other reasons is that the earnings from the carbon tax was clearly not earmarked. There was just they dedicated to the general budget, and so we lacked kind of narrative, of explication, of story to explain what those earnings were used to be. So that was perhaps the most the most lessons we can learn from that. I can move to my second example. To next slide, please. Regarding to cars and mobility issues. Regarding the car fleet, household car fleet, we can see that the structure of and the category of polluting cars is very different from when you compare low income and high income groups. On the graph, you see that almost 2/3 of the fleet owned by the lowest income groups are indeed the most polluting cars, and on the highest income group, it's exactly the contrary. So of course, those fleet from the low income group are, let's say, overrepresented in the total emissions of NOx and particles. Another way to picture that, next slide, please, is related to the low emissions zones projects we have in several metropolitan areas in France. Perhaps not that clear, but here you have the expected low emissions zone around Paris. And on the left-hand side, you have in in dark green, the share of polluting vehicles owned by household in those local areas, and you see that the eastern side are display very high share of those polluting vehicles, almost a quarter. And of course, when you turn to income groups on the right hand side, it's exactly the contrary. So here we have a real subject, I think. Next slide. Just to picture the car scraping scheme that was set by the French government for a couple of years. So it's a scraping scheme. So you have a subsidy to replace an older vehicle and to buy another one, possibly less polluting. It was created in 2015, and it really had a boost, let's say, in 2018, with a slightly change in the criteria for eligibility, especially the fact that you were now able to buy a second-hand vehicle. And in 2019, we also had a bonus for very low-income households, and also for let's say heavy driving households, and then we had a second peak in those subsidies. Next slide, please. Perhaps, so just to show, just look on the left hand side that indeed the largest share of beneficiary was indeed non-taxable households. So let's say household belonging to the 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 deciles. So we targeted this kind of population, and when you can get to the next slide. Yes, and when you perform a cost benefit analysis, so taking into account, of course, cost of purchase and so on, but also let's say social benefits in terms of reducing CO2 emission, NOx emissions, particles emissions. You can show that in fact the welfare benefits are quite high, in fact, for low-income households. It's the green bar on the right lower graph. See, so it's a kind of double dividend. You solve another problem, and you also allow low-income groups to change their cars and make a transition. And it's also because one of the presentation mentioned health co-benefits. By the fact, it's also at the end good for themselves, because those groups generally live in more dense areas where pollution issues are more accurate. So just to conclude, I think run out of time. Perhaps two thoughts or ideas for the discussion. I think we have to from the policymaker side, it's quite difficult to stay focused, as I said, or to stay on track. Just two quick examples. During the recovery plan in the post-COVID crisis, the criteria for the scraping scheme was a little bit softer. I mean, because we need to foster a little bit the overall car purchase market. And so we allowed more households to benefit from that, and we also let's say less dirty vehicle to be changed. And as a consequences, you can see that on the graph on the right hand side, the overall welfare benefits decreased, in fact, in 2020 due to that effect. Second example is very let's say update example. I think in the current energy crisis, at least in France, we took a very short-term reaction as a general rebates on energy consumption taxes. It's useful because it's really easy to implement, but those kind of policy means that a higher share of the general public support will go to a higher income household, because those higher income households, they drive more in terms of kilometers per household. So in that sense, it's not let's say it's anti-redistributive policy. So with that respect, targeted support to low income is far much better policy, I think. So it's going to it leads to my second point. once you said that you want to address vulnerable households and to capture the various sources of heterogeneity and vulnerability, it's good. But if you say that, you have a big step ahead in terms of operationalize that and in terms of administrative efficiency and burden. And last, and I will conclude that, all that turns about relying on this let's say four terms, because you want to give incentives to people generally from taxes or from subsidies. But if you do that, of course, they have to have an alternative to change their behavior or their car or their dwellings and so on. But generally, providing alternatives needs or providing subsidies needs funds, and where you get funds generally by taxing someone or somewhere. So here you are in kind of an infernal circle, and I think it's quite a question to the way you enter in this circle. So if you have a clue or an advice for the balanced recipe of those various elements, we're very glad to hear that. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Vincent. So as I said, I invite you to post your questions in the chat, but there are already several, and I think I start with one that was primarily for Irina, I think, on, I mean, I'll take the question a bit broader. The question was basically, can you somehow check the effect on industry allocation between formal and informal sectors? But I think I pose it a bit more broadly. I mean, in many of the countries that you spoke about, so the lower income and developing countries, there's also an issue of a social or a benefit system or social benefit system that's not very functional. So targeting policies, lower incomes is much more difficult. Yeah, it's also one of the reasons why we see a lot of fossil fuel subsidies, presumably in these countries. This is something that easily reaches. So there's the informal sector, you know, the social benefit systems. These two things are actually quite linked because you don't see people's incomes very easily, or you don't have a good collection. So I'm wondering how, I mean, if you can tell us a bit more on the effects that you may expect between the formal and informal, and also on how to maybe overcome this challenge of you know, a not very effective benefit system.
Yeah, thank you very much for that question. That's now extremely broad. So I guess, first of all, I would like to emphasize that, yes, it's true that the poor and vulnerable, they are facing the biggest difficulties to adjust to any kind of economic transformation. And I think that's a point that also Francesco made. However, in low-income countries, we don't have a choice. So they still need to go inevitably through economic transformation, and both to achieve the SDGs, which are broad, and second, of course, to do that ideally in a low-emitting manner. And so that is, I guess, why I try to emphasize the structural support to households more broadly. So while admittedly some lower income countries have implemented quite effective cash transfer mechanisms using e-wallets and e-money, which can work quite well. Yes, the targeting absolutely is an issue, and oftentimes it's more a spatial targeting than an income targeting. And there we really see a lot of opportunity to use climate fiscal reforms to support development goals more broadly. So that is, as I said, access to electricity and the grid. This is really not to be underestimated. In some countries, we have a grid and reliable and affordable electricity access that is negligible. And that is something that there's so much discussion about clean cook stoves, etc. But I mean, my grandma also cooked on wood, and now I'm cooking not on wood. I cook on electricity stove. So it's definitely something that needs to be in the focus for environmental policies. And in the richer world, there's often this discussion of the double dividend, cutting income taxes, which doesn't help the informal sector at all, and lump sum transfers, which also might not be reaching the right people. So that's why I guess on the one hand structural, on the other hand early action and well targeted and really with a long-term view support should be designed.
Thanks a lot. I mean, these questions are not restricted to the person they're going to. So if anybody else wants to step in, obviously welcome. I think you can raise your hand. I think one interesting aspect of what you said was the spatial targeting, which I think is also the question that Vincent you were mentioning in the Gilets jaunes context between the rural and the urban households. I don't know if you want to. I mean, it's also an issue for advanced economies to some respect. I don't know if you want to say something on that, or we go to the next question.
No, it's just I just noted that in fact that the distributional of the heterogeneity, sorry, in the, I think it was the Côte d'Ivoire example that Irina shows. In fact, it really echoed the same issues in France, in fact. And I think I also had in mind an example. I think it's in Austria, the recent measure that took to face the recent energy crisis. I think they built a compensating scheme regarding especially let's say areas and localization and urban and rural things. So I think it was interesting and inspiring also.
Okay, thanks a lot for that. And there was another question to Francesco, but as I said, anybody can step in if they have other ideas. But that was on hearing which solutions in terms of actionable policy measures you would recommend to achieve a deep, low carbon structural changes that are needed for avoiding the negative effects you outline.
If I would have the answer, I would not be here. Probably. No, I'm kidding. Well, I think that that's of course very complicated. I mean, I think that Irina already gives some type of suggestion. I mean, I think that is obvious also in terms of political acceptability that we have to combine a kind of stick and carrot. Okay, so actually we need subsidies. We need to spend public money in a way to compensate the losers, but also to, for efficiency purposes, because as Irina said, for the electrification, but it's not only needed to build the infrastructure in developing countries, but also in developed countries. Let's think about the issue of intermittency of renewable energy, but this requires also infrastructure to be built. So actually, well, I think that, and also all the infrastructure, for instance, to recycle the rare earth material that we need for these technologies is also, again, an infrastructure investment. So, well, actually here, I think that the insights of development economics are very important. And of course, I mean, think about, all the policy papers of Roderick. I mean, some of them you can find them more reliable, others not. But I mean, there are some principles, some ideas that are useful, and including the idea, of course, of coordination, complementarity. The point is that there is a lot of case by case, and actually, what I was suggesting on where there is a bit of now more evidence in labor economics is that this targeting of training program is extremely important. So taking really a sectoral perspective that involves also, companies in designing the training program. Well, I think this is extremely important. And also I think it's extremely important to start thinking that, perhaps automation is not a necessity. We can also think that the direction of technical change is in our hands. Okay, this is a bit Acemoglu recent ideas, and I mean we don't have to accept that everything will be automated and a robot will do everything for us. But we can also think about economies where there are still different direction of technology. But it, of course, is more is kind of more challenging. And well, last, I mean, I think that is clear what emerged about the tension between populism, increased inequality, acceptability of climate change. And so on this side, that has also a very big regional dimension, I think we have to, do a lot, but of course it's not an easy solution. So for instance, going back to the work of Joseph, I would be very curious to see, a follow-up perhaps of this type of very rigorous analysis on how the people that benefit most of a cleanup in their neighborhood will change their preference if there are some measure, of kind of attitude toward climate change or attitude toward, in the region, if you can link this and is perhaps also very, descriptive level, if there is some possible idea of.
Thanks a lot. Thanks for your insights. I think it's good you didn't give us the complete answer, because then we could just all go home and we would have nothing to do, right? But thanks a lot. Okay, there's something else in the chat, but I had a question for. Okay, I had a question for Joseph in the meantime. You said something like that there's no systematic pattern in the effects of the different types of policies that are analyzed. I was wondering whether that's, and I'm not asking for a meta-analysis right off the top of your head, but it's a speculation, whether that's related to the design any specific design features of the policy. So some would have more unequal effects, some would induce more equal effects because of their design, or whether there's any other reasons, or maybe there is no systematic period. Yeah, I mean, anything you could tell us on that?
Yeah, I guess I'd start with the distinction between the question some of the other panelists discussed, which is how stringent is climate policy, or how much pollution are we going to reduce? And then a different kind of question, which is more in the vein of what I was asking, which is, given we want to reduce pollution by 10%, what policy tool will we use to accomplish it? They're both important questions, but they're different. One is, how much do we want to achieve? And the other is, what kinds of tools are we going to use to do it? And so the research I was describing is saying, given some change in environment we want to achieve, are we going to use standards which tell every power plant reduce emissions by 10%, or they say it's illegal to use coal, or they say you have to use clean coal, versus the kinds of policies that involve prices and exchanges and transactions, which economists tend to call market-based policies, like pollution taxes and cap and trade markets. And so the paper I described, and then a handful of other papers in the literature, our reading of it is that they don't systematically show that using the more cost-effective, efficient policies, namely cap and trade markets and pollution taxes, using those policies versus standards doesn't systematically change the allocation of pollution across communities. And so then one interpretation of your question is, why is that? What is it about taxes versus cap and trade markets versus standards that means they don't systematically change where pollution is located? And the kind of deep underlying force that I think determines things is that for every power plant or every factory or every pollution source, there's some cost to that source to clean up pollution. And jargon economists would call it the marginal abatement cost, but it says go to every power plant and figure out how much does it cost to decrease pollution by 1% from that source. And the really deeper question is it the case that the places where it's expensive to clean up pollution are cases located in low-income minority communities? Maybe the oldest, dirtiest plants with the least flexible technology are the ones that happen to be located in low-income communities. Conversely, maybe it's the plants that just opened that are the most flexible, that have the fanciest machinery and computers that are most adaptable. Maybe it's the newest open plants that are in low-income minority communities. I could tell other stories, but those are just conjectures. And ultimately, the empirical question is, the places where it's easy to clean up pollution, do those places happen to be in low-income communities or communities of color? And our takeaway from this literature is that there is not a systematic pattern like that across at least a handful of air pollution markets in the US. And so when people are concerned pollution taxes might have adverse effects on inequality, or maybe cap and trade has adverse effects, and so we should use standards, the limited evidence we have from a handful of markets doesn't seem consistent with that. It doesn't seem like there's a systematic pattern that the places where it's cheap to clean up pollution are places where there's a lot of low-income households or communities of color. It just doesn't appear to be that pattern, but there's only a handful of markets and the evidence is still somewhat preliminary.
Okay, I think Francesco, you had your hand.
No, yeah, I wanted just to one thing that following what Joseph was saying. I mean, actually, at the end of the day, what you're saying in a way, we can say that there is an underlying force that is like technology that in a way dominate over policy design in the way pollution is located. I mean, revealed comparative advantage determines where polluting plants are located, because in that case, it would be interesting to understand more, reframe the issue in terms of revealed comparative advantage of, you know, polluting plants, and I think that's very relevant also for developing countries.
Yeah, a lot of the question of comparative advantage has to do with outsourcing polluting activity to low-income countries, or which countries specialize in clean versus dirty activity. And here I think it's much more an economic geography kind of question within cities. For example, in the US, a lot of low-income households and communities of color tend to be located in a very center of a city, in inner city communities. And you do find a lot of old polluting plants in those locations because they were built before there were a lot of cars. And so there's 100-year-old coal plants right in the center of big cities. Those particular plants do tend to be located in low-income communities and communities of color. On the other hand, there's a lot of rural poverty and low-income communities in rural areas, and you also find polluting plants in those locations. So I think the forces that determine is pollution in the US or China and Mexico are somewhat different than the forces that determine are the polluting plants in the city center or rural area or suburbs. And the question is also not just which plants emit pollution, but rather where is it cheapest to clean up pollution? And those can have different answers. Sometimes the cleanest plants are also the places where it's the hardest to clean pollution further.
Okay, thanks a lot. I had a question to Vincent also before we maybe wrap up. I was really struck by your map of the Paris surroundings, because it really kind of plays well, I think, into some of the, you know, say, I'm going to caricature this a bit, but, you know, so if you're a poor supermarket worker driving with four of your friends to the center of Paris to your work, oh, sorry, you have to take the metro because you can't enter Paris with your little Clio. But if you have you live in the Yvelines and you have your Porsche hybrid plug-in, which may not be even charged, so it's actually emitting quite a bit, no problem, you can go in, right? So that kind of, you know, that's maybe an exaggeration, but there is this issue of would you have a similar map with infrastructure? So basically the availability of I guess, you know, public transport or good public transport that would get you to Paris Center, and the other one would be, I know, charging stations or something like that. Is there anything you can give it, and the importance of the availability of infrastructure in you know, changing the perception of some of these things?
Well, yeah, very good question. I don't think you are too much in a caricature, and at least probably the way perhaps most people see things, and the way people see things are important in policy making, in fact. Yeah, it's good to, but probably if you had an extra slide with infrastructure access and public transportation and so on, perhaps just you will add another source of discrepancy and inequality somehow. And in fact, in the current previous years and in the upcoming years, there is a, let's say, stronger infrastructure program to develop, expand a little bit public transport precisely in the eastern part, and also let's say around Paris. One of the main problem of public transportation in Paris or in Ile-de-France region is that they are very centered to Paris, and it's very difficult to just turn around. And sometimes you don't want to cross Paris. You just want to move around, and this is very costly in terms of public transport for the moment, because you have to get back to the center and then go outwards. So perhaps it's the main issue regarding that.
Okay, thank you very much. I just want to say, if any one of the speakers wants to say anything additional before we close up, this is the chance. So I don't see any hands. So, I mean, first of all, thank you very, very much for this. It was a very interesting session. I'm not going to try to summarize it because that's well beyond my capacity, but it was a very interesting session, and sorry for running a bit over time. I will pass it now to Nicolina, who will do some closing remarks, I guess. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Thomas, and thank you everyone for joining us for this workshop on the social and distributional implications of environmental policies. A particular thanks to the speakers and the moderators for their direct contributions, but also to everyone that joined the webinar and contributed with their questions and comments. Equally, a thanks to the European Commission for their support to our work in this area. I will try and highlight a few key messages that have emerged over the past couple of days, but as we can see from the discussion over these past, or today, over these past last two sessions, it's been extremely rich, so in no way will it be comprehensive. But let me just say, yesterday we were reminded of the challenges that governments face, having to accelerate action on climate and environment at a current time of difficult COVID-19 recovery and the geopolitical tensions, but also a cost of living crisis that we haven't seen for decades. And it's in this context that understanding the distributional impacts of environmental policies and their interactions is so important, in particular to ensure support for them in going forward. As has been noted a few times over the course of the past couple of days, the interactions are still not well understood, but we have heard experts share evidence available based on existing empirical approaches, and we hope that this can inform policy processes in our respective various country contexts. So, for example, we have heard that across OECD countries, the steady increase in environmental policy stringency has contributed to large environmental benefits, but also other important co-benefits such as health. And while the overall economic effects of the policies has been small, they are heterogeneous across and within countries, firms and industries, as well as over time. And today's discussion has really been effective in illustrating that. We heard also how different emission trading and pricing systems in Europe and China have been successful in reducing emissions without any significant effect on employment and profits on the regulated firm. But again, as Luke and others highlighted in the first session this morning, again here, there are diversities across segments of the society. Yesterday on innovation, it was noted that R&D policies coupled with environmental policies can be effective in not only promoting innovation, but also ensuring that new innovation is directed towards clean technologies. So while the picture at the overarching level is positive, it's more complex for individuals and consumers. And there, for example, it was noted yesterday that they are directly affected by the measures that impact their cost of living. And we heard examples of changes in energy prices or in transport, and their kind of limited, at least ability in the short term to switch between services available. Also across countries, as Ira presented in her presentation, we will see differences with policies, in some cases having an overarching progressive impact if the base level of energy consumption is low, but of course this varying across segments of the society, but also nature of their employment and so on. As Joe mentioned also, the case from US showing the distributional impacts of offset markets in the Clean Air Act, also their findings are not conclusive. As was noting yesterday and also partly this morning, fuel intensive sectors are in the short term particularly exposed to environmental regulation, but the employment benefits from investment also in renewable energy are not evenly distributed, as Natalia highlighted this morning. And it's such labor and skills impact that are a particular concern to many governments as they seek to protect the welfare of workers during the green transition that they are developing and implementing. So looking ahead, a key policy question is whether the current understanding of the economic and distributional impacts of environmental policies will still apply when governments have to significantly scale up the level of ambition of their environment and climate policies, which I think can all agree are dearly needed. So we'll take the discussion that has taken place over the past couple of days and spend some time to digest it. And we really look forward to continuing this discussion as we take that forward. But before we end, let me thank my colleagues Leah Strapper and Ilyas Mus for their invaluable support in organizing this workshop. Also the guidance provided by Sharko Agravala and additional support provided by members of the team. And let me mention all of them here. That's Helia Costa, Damian Dissot, Alberto Agnelli, Kate Farrow, Rose Mebiame, and Ioannis Tikodas, as well Clara Gaida are all gratefully acknowledged. So with that, let me conclude this workshop. Thank all of you and wish you a good weekend. Thank you, everyone.